The candidates for November are set.
I know Donald Trump's type.
Between now and Election Day,
we are not going back.
A campaign season unfolding faster.
Kamala Harris is not getting a promotion
Than any in recent history.
Make America great again.
Follow it all with new episodes every weekday on the NPR Politics Podcast.
You rely on this podcast to stay informed and connected with your local community, and we rely on you. Without listener support, this show simply wouldn't exist. Be a part of the team that makes this show possible by donating to our home, KUOW. It only takes a minute. Donate at KUOW.org or follow the link in the show notes. And thank you.
From KUOW in Seattle, welcome to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkmann. And I know, the presidential race is using up a lot of oxygen right now. But while state voters are mulling who to send back to the White House, they will also be asked to weigh in on a group of initiatives aimed at majorly shifting the direction of Washington politics. It's a story longtime residents have seen before. One man is trying to move the political pendulum in Olympia to the right, using citizens' initiatives instead of the typical legislative process. But this flurry of varied initiatives, all from the same source in the same election year, it all feels different from Tim Eymon's heyday in the late 90s. In just a few short years, Brian Heywood has become arguably the most consequential political figure in Washington state. Heywood is a Redmond-based hedge fund manager who spent millions of dollars of his own money to fund initiatives against the state's cap-and-trade system, capital gains tax, and long-term care insurance program. His PAC, Let's Go Washington, also gathered signatures for another initiative on your ballot about natural gas regulations. And those are just the measures you're going to be voting on in November. Let's Go Washington also gathered signatures for 3 initiatives that Democratic lawmakers adopted this year to keep them off the ballot: a Parents' Bill of Rights, a new police pursuit standard, and a ban on an income tax in the state. So he's a big deal. He's got big plans, and he's here in studio with me right now. Brian Heywood, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to get to talk with you.
My pleasure to be here. I don't ever really think of myself as a big deal, so it's sort of a weird thing to start. But I'm glad to be here, and I appreciate you guys covering these.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to start with a question about why. Why get involved in politics? You have this career as a hedge fund manager. You work with Japanese companies. You've been in Washington state since 2010, but you're stepping into a very visible political role with these initiatives. Why now?
I think there's a couple of things. Life choices get made by what's happening in your life at the time, but there's sort of a drive in a way that's pushed me here, I guess. I grew up fairly poor. Neither of my parents graduated from college. It was a big deal when I got into school. And I lived in a town that nobody had ever gone to school east of the Mississippi, right? It was sort of that thing. And so that was the background. And in that background, I was raised in a very self-sufficient, you never ask the government for money. It's there for people that really need it, not us. And that means that you want the government to not mess with you, really. Just leave me alone and let me be. And also was raised with a very strong love for the American ideal. Not that the country's perfect or that we've done everything right, but that this Constitution that we've got in the United States is something special. And so that's sort of the background that sort of shapes and informs a lot of my thinking. And moving here to Washington State in 2010, we brought like 40 families with us up from California, in part because California had become such a regulatory mess and the taxes kept going up and up and up that we thought, well, let's move someplace that's a little bit more free, I guess, in a way. And so we moved up 40 families, and they all got an immediate 13% increase in their salary just because they moved up here to Washington State, and they all bought houses and dived into the economy here.
Having moved from California to Washington, I know, and even just looking at jobs between the two states, you do have that feeling of like, oh, well, there's no income tax in Washington, so you know that there's going to be a difference there. Yeah.
Yeah, it made a big difference for everybody. And then the other thing, when we moved up here, it felt kind of like we were moving into a place that was California was a very, very progressive left state. The Republicans had been fleeing the state for years. Republicans were like less than 25% in the state. And it wasn't necessarily that it was more the balance than it was Republicans or Democrats, right? You get an imbalance. When we moved up here, it felt like we were moving into sort of a libertarian left sort of state, right? The laws tended to be a little bit, even if I didn't agree with them, they were sort of libertarian in their leaning, and it was like, don't mess with me and I won't mess with you. I want to be able to smoke pot, don't bug me. I can identify with that feeling of just don't mess with me, and the same thing with gay marriage. So I thought, well, okay, this is great. We're moving up to this libertarian left state. Immediately when we got up here, the very first year, Bill Gates Sr. was pushing, so here's billionaire money trying to push an income tax on everybody. And I thought, oh, no, we just moved up here. But then the citizens of the state rejected for I think the 9th or 10th time at that point, rejected the income tax overwhelmingly. It wasn't like a close call. They overwhelmingly rejected it. And I thought, oh, okay, well, we made a wise choice. The state on its website at the time had an invitation that said, come up here. We have the greatest schools in the nation. We have, and we did. I mean, we had like high schools in the Bellevue, Redmond, Kirkland area were in the top 5 in the nation. We have a clean environment. We have a great business environment. We have no capital gains taxes and no income taxes. Bring your business and come here. There was this. It was literally on the state website, and by the by, safety is second to none. Like we had a safe state, and so in 2010, that's the state that we moved into. And then I watched over the next, 5-10 years, a dramatic shift away from this sort of libertarian left to more of a, I don't know how to call it other than like a progressive left that was, I know better than you. I'm going to dictate what you need to do. And as we watch that, well, I can move again, right? I can move somewhere else, or I can stand and fight. And I think there were some pieces that really pushed me. Right? Some of these are in the initiatives that came out, but when you say that police cannot pursue criminals, I don't like. We get thousands of years of human behavior that says that's a stupid idea. For a while, we had the Attorney General was advocating openly about let's do a complete non-criminalization of all drugs. And I don't think that there's, well, to me, it didn't seem like common sense was anywhere near that decision at all. And then there were several things. There were several of them that were on the ballot, and the voters rejected them. The long-term care rejected at the ballot. The Climate Commitment Act rejected at the ballot.
It was a revenue neutral carbon tax.
Right. All these things have been rejected at the ballot, and then I often refer to in the movie Aladdin, the Disney Aladdin, where the parrot Iago, he always talks about how the king, then I'll shove the cracker down his throat. It feels like that's kind of
that's what the lawmakers in Olympia are to you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what in my mind it was that sort of imagery of they're like, well, we don't really care what you think. We're going to shove this down your throat. And I was just actually yesterday at Seattle Times for the editorial review for the 21-24, which is the long-term care. Mm-hmm. And one of the lawmakers, who I respect, she's a smart person, but one of the lawmakers that helped design the law was there. And her defense was basically, well, people are so stupid they don't know that this is good for them. So we need to force them to do this. And I'm saying, well, let's give people a choice. And I think right there is the fundamental difference. I believe that people, and I don't mind if people make wrong, I'm putting that in scare quotes, right? Wrong decisions. One of the great things about America is this incredible political freedom that we've got as a people, and it's uncommon. I've been all around the world, and it's really uncommon, even in places that are very safe and seem very stable. There's a fundamental fear below the law that if you got in trouble, you're in trouble. Like if you get too political, you're in trouble. And here we've got this freedom to disagree and to think differently, and even disagree on how much we think the government should be involved in our lives. And it's that idea that I know better than you. I'm going to tell you what you have to do. Mm-hmm. And that sort of has pushed me a lot to get into this. That was a long intro.
No, yeah, but I think it helps people understand where you're coming from. We're going to get to the long-term care insurance issue. I will say I doubt that the proponents of keeping the long-term care insurance are framing it quite as you just framed it, but we'll get to it in a little bit. You've chosen to use the initiative process here instead of run for high office, instead of run for governor or something like that. Why initiative processes?
The initiative, so I think it's a brilliant part of the Constitution in Washington State. What the founders of the writers of the Constitution in Washington, I think they must have envisioned a time when one party could be so in control that they don't even listen to their own voters, people on their own partisan side. And at that point, you needed something. If they get so out of touch with people, you needed some mechanism that could remind them that their job is because of the people. And I get people saying, well, they're democratically elected. Why don't you just let them do their thing? And that's fine. They're doing their thing. But I think the initiative process is to remind them that the people are out there. And on these initiatives, we gathered 3.2 million signatures. And I ran a statistical model to try to identify politically where people stand. It's not perfect, but everybody in the state does it on both sides of the political alley. And our numbers came up with the people that actually signed at least one initiative were about 57% Democrat or independent, and 43% were Republican. And that's fairly when do you have something that nonpartisan in the state? These resonated across people of all sides.
In 2022, you and Kerry Condata, the former Republican state legislator and former chair of the Chelan County Republican Party, you had 11 initiatives that you were working on getting on the ballot. Those did not get on the ballot. The big difference between then and now is that you decided to open the wallet and say, I'm going to pay for signature gathering. So I think some people will say that doesn't show a broad base of support. That shows your ability to fund signature gatherers. What do you say to that?
Well, I'd like them to try to go, money or no money, go sit out in front of a Walmart and get people to put your name on something. What I didn't have, what I realized is I just didn't know enough people, right? It's a big state. You've got to have people on both sides of the Olympics and the Cascades.
The volunteer-only situation in 2022 wasn't going to cut it.
I just don't know enough people. Nobody does. Nobody knows enough people. No one running for office statewide knows enough people. You have to be able to get your message out there for people to hear it. And then they get to choose. And it's not like, oh, yeah, I raised my hand and I don't have any accountability. I'm writing my name down. I'm putting my address on a document that's going to go to the Secretary of State.
And it's public.
And people know that. They're signing their name. There's people that support it. They go, I support it, but I'm afraid of having my name somewhere in a database. They're afraid of Bob Ferguson or someone retaliating against them. So I'd like to challenge anybody that feels that way. Go ahead and take something that you really think is popular and important and go get signatures for it, one. And then number two, the funny thing is the people that are against, that are sort of throwing shade on me about this, they're also all the ones that were really happy when Nick Hanauer and Bill Gates and other people gave money to anti-gun initiatives, and there was a bunch of money they were trying to raise to legalize all drugs. They're fine if the money comes from someone that they support politically, but when it's someone they don't support politically, then suddenly they're all offended and up in arms about the money and accusing. I'm not trying to. I think if they want to get upset about money in politics, go look at the lobbyists. The big corporations spend tons of money on lobbyists. I've been in the meetings and I watch these little lobbyists scurry around and talk to all the legislators and try to curry favor there. And that's a place you want to shine some light. Let's shine some light right there. This is people in the state. Unique individuals. We got 1.2 to 1.3 million unique individuals that signed at least one initiative. Show me anyone that's got something that broad-based, and I'll back down.
All of these initiatives that you've sponsored this year, besides the Parents' Bill of Rights, they're rollbacks. They're overturning existing laws or taxes or putting things back to previous standards. Opponents say you're tearing things down but you're not presenting alternatives. So, for example, the Climate Commitment Act, you want to get rid of the carbon pricing system, but what's the alternative to address global warming? Things like that. So I guess that gets to a fundamental question we've kind of been addressing so far this hour, which is, what is your vision for the role of government? Is it just fully get it out of the way? And is it a fully libertarian kind of model, like only national defense? Or what do you see as its proper place in governing and being in people's lives?
I think I'm not a full sort of extreme end of the libertarian side that says government should not do anything. I think it plays a really important role. I think that it plays a different role at the state and the federal level, let's say, right? At the state level, I think an important role of government is the infrastructure, so the bridges and the roads and the ferries and that sort of thing. It plays an enormous role. In fact, I would probably put 50% of our budget, I would put it into education here in the state. And I think that's an important place.
Public education. So you do believe in public education?
Yeah. But I don't think public education is perfect. I wouldn't have any problem with a broader range of options to help people, right? That especially, I think public education, who does it screw? It screws the people at the bottom end of the education pool. I watched in California, one of the school districts, they would get teachers that had done something that was inappropriate. But the teachers union is so strong that they can't fire them. So what did they do? They would shove them over into essentially the schools across the tracks, if to use an old phrase, right? And those were places where, single parents are raising kids. They're not able to go in and challenge the school. Why is this teacher terrible? The upper middle class and upper income schools had parents that were involved and came in and said, why is this teacher? And they would get the teacher chased out. And then they put them over in this other district, which was poor. And the parents were working lots of hours and didn't have time to go down and chase the school. So the public schools, we're way off track here, but I think the public schools. I
asked you an open-ended question. Yeah. I'm getting an open-ended answer. Yeah.
I believe in public schools. I went to public schools. All my kids went to public schools. But I don't think that they always provide. I'm not sure that they always provide the value for the people that are at the bottom end of the economic ladder.
But big picture, you do believe in funding schools.
Absolutely.
Do you believe in any kind of environmental regulation?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of things that happened in the 70s that really took us from
Clean Air Act, things like that.
Yeah. And one of the challenges with government programs, though, is it can start out with a good idea, and usually they're well-intentioned, I believe. But at some point, what happens is it becomes a self-sustaining bureaucracy, or not even self-sustaining. It becomes a growing, hungry bureaucracy that needs more money and more money and more money. And and the way that you justify more money is you create more regulations, not legal laws, but you actually, by regulatory fiat, you grow to such a monster that you're suddenly consuming this enormous budget, and then you complain, well, we don't have enough money, we got to raise taxes. And it's that cycle that I think is very detrimental to economies, to innovation, to people growing their businesses and living their lives. And that's where I think I would sort of that line in there. There's some place in there that it goes too far.
He's Brian Heywood, and he is behind Let's Go Washington and 3 initiatives that are going to be on your ballot this November. As you heard, he believes in public education. He believes in certain environmental policies, but he is also targeting some of those things in 3 of these initiatives that are on the ballot. And we're going to get to that in just a minute, right here on Soundside on KUOW.
Hearing static when you enter a tunnel in the middle of a fascinating story? Hanging out in your driveway to catch the end of a report? We've been there. With the KUOW app, you can listen to your favorite programs anytime and anywhere. No driveways required. Let's get going. Download the KUOW app now, available for iOS and Android.
You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkmann, and I'm here with Brian Heywood, the man behind Let's Go Washington, and 3 initiatives that you will see on the November ballot, including a repeal of the Climate Commitment Act, a repeal of the state capital gains tax on profits over $260,000, excluding real estate, and an initiative making a tax to support a long-term care insurance program in the state optional. Now, we're going to get to policy here. Brian, let's start with the Climate Commitment Act. I did interview Todd Myers this week on the Washington Policy Center. We got way in the weeds, as Todd is wont to do. But, big picture for folks who are just catching up, you're going to be deciding if you're a voter in Washington state on whether to keep the Climate Commitment Act in place. That's Initiative I-2117. If approved, it would dismantle the state's cap and trade system. So this is a system that lawmakers put in place a couple years ago. It creates auctions for major polluters. Companies can purchase carbon allowances. Each one lets them emit about a metric ton of planet-warming carbon dioxide. This is a mechanism for the state to, according to supporters, reach its goal of net zero emissions by 2050. The initiative, if it passes, it would also ban the state from implementing any future similar carbon auctions. I know you've raised concerns about implementation of this law. You've talked about how you believe it is a regressive tax on low-income people because it has arguably raised gas prices. That's not an argued point, but the amount that it's raised is what's been argued. You've also raised questions about the value of projects that are funded with the revenue. I want to ask you a basic question just to start out. What is the role of the state in reducing carbon emissions? Do you think the state should have any role in reducing carbon emissions?
Should the state have any role? Sure.
I guess another way to ask that is, would you support another type of carbon pricing system or some other type of limits, just not in the form of a cap and trade system?
I would support something that's effectively doing, it sounds like a cop-out, but something that works. And I don't think that, I think the way that the current Olympia operates is we don't really care about the effect of what we do. We care about how much money we spend. And we're going to measure success by how much money we spend. So I have very little confidence that right now, as is, without some real shakeup, that they're going to come out with something that does something meaningful. And the reason, especially on this cap and trade, is that governments around the world have found it's a fantastic way to raise money off the backs of commuters with a very inelastic effect, meaning you have to raise the price of gas enormously high before commuters quit driving. They'll keep paying, and that means steady source of money coming in, steady source of money.
People don't have options. They have to get to work.
They have to. Oh, well, we've got light rail, but okay, only if you want to get meth on your way in.
I take the light rail, Brian. I don't get meth. Right. I like the light rail.
All right, touche. But it's not. It would the cost to get it, so it was really an effective alternative, is ludicrously high. And we've done stupid things even with our ferries. We could have gone, instead of waiting to go to some ultimate electric ferry that's perfect, which is still maybe 2035, by the time we get these things. There's much cleaner diesel out there. I was just out, this is going to sound like a real tangent, but I was just out with some farmers out in Colfax.
My mother was born in Colfax.
Oh, really? That's a really cool little town. Mm-hmm. I mean, just right in that valley between those two. Yeah. So a guy brings in what's called a quad track, which is this monster tractor with big, triangular tracks that go around. And this thing, the technology that they put into this thing, the air coming out, it has filters where the air coming out is actually cleaner than the air going in. But it's a big diesel tractor. And it has all kinds of other technological aids in it to dramatically reduce the number of chemicals it sprays. I mean, technology has taken us in this really exciting way.
Yeah, but if you believe in that kind of green technology, there's a lot of ways in which the revenue from this CCA, the auctions, are supposed to go to that, right? They're being earmarked for the electric ferries, the changing people over to more efficient kinds of heating and cooling. These investments, switching over from, electrifying buses, things like that, these investments are trying to go to the green infrastructure and the new technology, the latest and greatest, right? And if you do go back and rebid those ferries, they say that it's going to take even longer to get them delivered. So, ultimately, it's kind of like do you believe in the projects, the goals of these investments from the CCA, from the funding? Do you just not like the implementation? Do you think that the government should be investing big in green energy at all? Or is it like, no, this is the role of the private sector and not the role of government?
I think the government, a smart government, and I don't think currently we have that. So that's part of my complaint here. I think smart government could come up with some really interesting ideas and work with business so that instead of picking the technology, it enabled the maximum amount of interesting ideas to come forward. But what the government does instead is it says, we're going to bet on this technology or this idea or this company. And they use the word invest so that people go, oh, they're being free market. They're not. They're chasing away all of their investments. So one of the things I cite is Solyndra was interesting during the Obama administration. They gave $1 billion into Solyndra to do solar technology. As soon as the government put its heavy hand of $1 billion into Solyndra, all the private money fled. It said there's no way. And then what happened, Solyndra, because it got suddenly $1 billion, instead of having any sort of discipline, it wasted the money and went bankrupt. So it was this complete, total boondoggle that hurt, I think. It set back technology by years because the government had put its heavy hand in picking a winner or a loser.
But what about the ways that the government can create chances for more innovation?
So
investing in the kind of things like electric chargers for EVs or the air pollution monitors, things like that are like infrastructure that then make the innovation more possible. It's the kind of investment at a large scale that doesn't come from private industry.
Well, I think those things all would come from private industry. I'm in Japan. I know there's companies working on those things. But anywhere where the government puts its heavy hand in, people stay away.
Japan has such an amazing public transit infrastructure, though.
It does. But I'm talking about all the electrical, the battery technology and all of that. There's a ton of money in private sector going to radically change the way that we have energy usage in Japan. But when the government here puts its heavy hand into something, it chases all the infrastructure away. And let me give you an example of how it could work, though. What the government does, so one is its measurement for success is how much money we spend. That has to change. That's not a good measurement for success. Number two, what they could do, instead of saying, hey, you're the one, we've done our research, we're going to pick you. There's no way. If you told me, take a bunch of investment firms and take government employees, and which one's going to make a better investment decision? There's no way I'm going to put my money. If I got to put my own money, I'm not putting it into the government picking, right? The only reason you would is because crony capitalism and they're locking everybody else out. But they're not good pickers. They historically have never been that way. Instead, if you said, we're going to reward output, we're going to reward success rather than fund the startup, people would fall over themselves putting their own money, investors' money, to work, trying to create something creative and innovative. And I'll give you another example. We
do have to move on because we're going to get to two other policies. Right. But if you don't mind, if we can just
sure.
jump over. So, one thing I think we both agree on is that it would be nice if the state would have the updated carbon numbers coming out about the greenhouse gas emissions from the past 5 years. Our most recent data is from 2019. The state, we asked the Department of Ecology about this. They said that it's delayed because of a lag in federal data. We are still hoping to see that, but it's not expected to come out statewide inventory from 2022, at least until later this year. You're listening to Soundside on KUOW. When we come back, I'll continue my conversation with Brian Heywood of Let's Go Washington. He's the man behind 3 initiatives on your ballot this November. When we come back, we'll talk about his challenge to the state's capital gains tax. That's in a moment here on KUOW.
Hi there, I'm Monica Guzman, host of A Braver Way podcast and your guide across the political divide. Are you done with the divisiveness in our politics and ready to do something about it? This season, we've partnered with KUOW to reach more listeners like you. Join me as I sit down with guests from across the political spectrum. Together, we'll share tools, insights, and messy, real-life stories to help you face this election year without losing heart. Listen to A Braver Way now on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkmann, and I'm continuing my conversation with Brian Heywood. His name is not on the ballot this November, but he has played a major role in what Washingtonians will be voting on. He spent millions of dollars of his own money to get 3 initiatives on the ballot. One to repeal the state's carbon emissions auctions. Another would make the state's long-term care fund optional to pay into. And the third would end the capital gains tax that the state has had for a couple years now. Just a note on this next segment. Heywood will be referring to a $19 billion surplus that he says the state has had over the last 5 years. Now, we talked to his campaign about this. He's counting the leftover money in the general fund each year, adding it all up. That general fund includes taxes raised by the state. Let's Go Washington did provide the numbers that they were using, and it did add up to roughly $19 billion. Now, we asked the state's Office of Financial Management about this method of tabulation. They took issue with it. They said that they would not add up the fund balances at the end of each year or session to get a total surplus. Here's a quote from the state. The ending fund balance for one year becomes the beginning fund balance for the next year, and so on, as that's the way balance sheets work. If they total up the multiple years, they would be counting the same money again and again. So as you can hear, the state disputes that $19 billion number is accurate. Okay, with that out of the way, we will continue my conversation with Brian Heywood, and I asked him about why he wants to axe the capital gains tax. Let's Go Washington is backing a repeal of the capital gains tax, which legislators passed in 2021. That's Initiative 2109 for folks keeping score on their ballots. Washington State right now levies a 7% tax on the sale or exchange of stocks, bonds, business interests, and other long-term capital assets. The tax kicks in on profits over, now it's $262,000 because of inflation. So every dollar over that is taxed, over $262,000. Real estate is exempt. Capital gains tax revenue generates money for education. The first $500 million goes to schools, early learning, and childcare programs. Any money brought in above $500 million goes to school building funds. Getting rid of a tax on high earners that funds the education budget. Why cut the tax?
First of all, because the state had a $19 billion surplus over the last 5 years. $19 billion. This isn't a revenue problem. This is a priority problem. They knew they had plenty of money to spend on any of these things. The first year, the tax brought in about $700 million. And then unremarkably, unsurprisingly, a bunch of rich people moved out of the state. We won't mention Jeff Bezos' name, but all these people moved out of the state, and the number was down to $400 million.
Well, also, they might be just watching to see if your initiative is successful, right? And before selling their assets.
Certainly. I'm sure that. Well, because they can. But they can also move assets offshore. Jeff Bezos, for 5 years before the capital gains tax, every year was selling billions of dollars of stock. In the 2 years that the capital gains tax was here implemented, he quit selling and then moved to Florida to, quote, be with his mother, where he she convinced him to start selling again. That's not a coincidence, right? That's because he was getting around this capital gains tax. So number one, they had plenty of money. Number two, that's sort of deceptive in how they say the money's going. It's primarily going to daycare. It's this first $500 million goes to daycare. Anything above that goes to schools or goes to building schools. If you look at dive in, I've done some deep rabbit hole digging. Look at what's happened to daycare in our state, and we've lost since 1996, when the state started to really regulate daycare. We've gone from 8,600 family home daycare centers to about 3,000. We've lost 5,600 daycare centers. The total number of seats in daycares has stayed about the same because we have some large daycare centers, but we've created these huge daycare center deserts in the state. So if you're in a big city, you might be able to find something. In other places, the regulation is shut them down and run them out of business. So we created a problem, I believe, because we regulated. Well, there's over 100 pages. If you look,
why not work on lobbying for deregulating and look at, ways to move this funding into, ways that you believe is more effective? I mean, these laws can be tweaked. These laws can be updated. Early learning and childcare programs, if you want to call them daycare, like a lot of people would say that's a really important thing and a really important thing for the workforce.
Agreed, 100%. But we had $19 billion surplus that we could have spent that on. This is the taxes only brought in $400 million this year. By comparison, long-term care tax brought in $1.3 billion, and the CCA brought in $2 billion. On top of the $19 billion surplus that we've had, I would argue that the state had plenty of money to fund all kinds of daycare dreams. I mean, they could have done a lot more even than they're doing with this tax.
Every, person who looks at, the issue of childcare and stuff says it's broken. So I'm not going to argue with that we have an issue with childcare. But I don't know that people would be convinced that pulling money out of the system is the way to do it. I'm hearing you say that you believe it's priorities of the legislature, and that's something that people have chosen to spend money in certain ways. Most states in the country have capital gains taxes. Idaho has a capital gains tax. All the western states have higher ones. In fact, not Idaho, but Oregon, California, Arizona, they're all higher than us. Why should Washington be the outlier?
Well, Washington's also been one of the most prolific states in the entire nation. Our economy has dodged several really huge bullets. When everyone else is hurting, we're still making jobs. We're still employing people. And that is in large part because our state hung out a sign that said, come to this state. We don't have capital gains tax. We don't have income tax.
And unemployment has stayed low even with the capital gains tax being levied.
Except that if you just saw, there was just a Seattle Times article on shockingly high income earners. We had 13,000 high income families move out of the state and only 11,000 move in. It makes us so there's about a 2,000 deficit that happened there. We still have a lot of interesting. Microsoft, Facebook is big here. Google is big here. Amazon, enormous. We've got these incredible tech companies that, and we also have all the data centers that are out there by the energy. We've got all kinds of sub companies that go around these, attracted here by the tax and by the industry. We have a really robust economy that's not going to crash tomorrow. But when I've been in California when they killed the golden goose, I watched suddenly. Oh, really? It was only 2,000 families, only 2,000 high earners. Who cares about them? It was only Jeff Bezos. People start leaving a state.
But California and Silicon Valley are still very strong. I mean, and this move to Austin or Florida or whatever, like it seems to have been overblown. Like there's still really strong companies and a big innovation base, happening in the Bay Area. I do want to bring up It's
not like it was, though. It's really diminished.
And I do want to bring up the regressive tax issue, which I know you are not a fan of. You know what it's like to be working class, to have taxes hit lower income people harder. The Institution on Taxation and Economic Policy rated Washington state as having the most regressive tax system for decades. We have been supplanted by Florida this year, partly because of the capital gains tax. Washington, still number 2 on that list of regressive states, meaning that it hits the tax system, poor and working class folks hardest. The bottom 20% of earners in our state pay 3 times the tax rate that people at the very tippy top of the income scale do. I've heard it goes back to the Warren Buffett thing, saying like my secretary shouldn't pay a higher tax rate than me, a billionaire. So why get rid of a tax, which, again, we don't have an income tax in this state. We don't have these other ways that move us out of that regressive range. Why get rid of a tax on high earners with that in mind?
Well, what are you taxing for? So with the CCA, we're taxing people because we don't want them to drive anymore. We're punishing people that use gasoline cars, and we want them to stop. That's the purpose of that tax. And then if it raises a bunch of money, we can do something with it. That's a side benefit. In this case, what are we doing? So is the idea to raise money when we already had $19 billion? So I would argue that it's not really about raising money. And in fact, Jamie Peterson, one of the senators, there was a Freedom of Information request and got information where Senator Peterson actually said in several internal emails, the purpose of I don't really care about the revenue from this. That's just a bonus. What this really is it's a way for us to get a backdoor income tax. I've modified his words, but you can look it up. It's out there.
The state Supreme Court says it's an excise tax. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to take it up, but go ahead. Yeah.
But that was the idea was using it as a mechanism. And already in the legislature, there was a bill last year and this year to lower the threshold from $260,000 down to $15,000 to add an additional rate. So it start at 8% at $15,000 and go up to 15%.
So you think it's a foot in the door?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But then how do we fix our regressive tax system? Again, it's like that, going back to that idea of like you're rolling this back, you're tearing this down, but what is the alternative? Again, it's not uncommon for states. Most states do have a capital gains tax, and we have made that choice as Washington voters. And as you have, instilled again, like there's not going to be an income tax. What's the alternative to make it less regressive here?
Well, I think you stop doing regressive taxes. We added a mandatory payroll tax. That's a regressive tax. We added a CCA, that's a regressive tax. We've got taxes on almost everything that we do, and we've got a surplus. So I think the question, the other side coming at me saying, "Wait, we need to change something here." If we were in a super deficit or we didn't have money to do the things that we need to do, they've got a leg to stand on. They're trying to get there because they're spending money like it's going out of business. Our budget is inflated 150%, but population has grown. Obviously not at that rate, like 15%. We're spending money at such a fast pace. We're expanding our budget. And then we're saying, oh my gosh, we don't have any money. We need more money. And the only way to solve it is to get this tax on this. And I think that if Washington pursues a case of going after the people that build capital, we will soon find out what it's like to have an economy that begins to tank. Already people are not moving here for the tax reasons. Seattle Times could not figure out why would wealthy people be moving out of the state. There was nowhere that they mentioned the capital gains tax. It was just a complete shocker to them. Why would they be moving out? We can't figure it out. And if they want to stick their head in the sand, that's fine. But
And I just because of time, we want to quickly touch the Washington Cares initiative. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. Again, we're going to have individualized conversations, pro and con, on each of these initiatives. Make the case here. So voters will see an initiative aimed at Washington Cares on their ballots. That's I-2124. If this initiative passes, the existing 0.5%, it's about 0.58% tax on paychecks would be optional instead of mandatory. That tax has been in place since July of 2023. It supports a long-term care insurance program that residents can draw on for caretaking, medication expenses for people who are older, injured, or disabled. Right now, most people who work in Washington state do pay this tax, with a few exemptions for those who are living out of state, in the military, or who already have a long-term care insurance situation and they opted out of the fund early. Lawmakers who pass this payroll tax say that it is designed to be less regressive than an excise tax or a sales tax because it is based on income, so 0.58% of your income. Make the case here, elevator pitch if you don't mind, on why you want to strike the requirement for paying into the fund.
500,000 people who had sophisticated HR departments were allowed to opt out. The others were, I'm going to use the word trapped, but if they weren't trapped, then they would want to be there voluntarily. If the program's so good, then you don't need to force people into it. What is interesting to me about this is my initiative would actually, I was debating the other side just yesterday, and they said, no, all these people that opted out, they want to come back in. My initiative would allow them to come back in if they want. So
gives them the choice.
It gives them the choice to get in.
But people say it's not really a choice because the system will go into a death spiral if you take out that many taxpayers. If I designed a product like that and sold it on the open market, Bob Ferguson would be suing me for fraud, right? And here it's okay because the state's doing it. Why is that okay? The other thing that I think is really important here, this thing is so enormously flawed. I'll give you a couple of examples. I have a friend that lives up in Okanagan. He was born with TARS. That means he doesn't have any arms. He's just got hands that sort of come out of the shoulders. He cannot work 500 hours a year. He can work a lot, but not 5. He just can't physically stand that long and can't. So he's going to, whatever, he'll work 300-400 hours, maybe max a year. He has to pay into the system.
but he'll never, ever qualify for it. A woman that works 9 years, then takes 5 years off to have a child, has to go back to year 0 after she comes back from having. A daughter that takes time out of work, takes 5 years out of work to go help take care of her mom, is no longer eligible if she takes 5 years off to take care of mom. So we got these huge problems with it, to which this other side says, well, we can fix it. And my response is, we had 2 years to fix it before this year, and you did nothing. This year, when I got the initiative qualified, suddenly they said, oh, we're going to deal with portability. They put this portability, that's portability in name only. It says you can do it, but it's hard.
There's a lot of arguments to say that the initiative process did push lawmakers to make changes in a number of these bills,
yes,
like the CCA
absolutely.
and like that kind of pressure did prompt a lot of that. I guess we just don't have time to get into like what is the alternative, because there is such a problem with long-term care. And I know that this is insufficient and you see it as a flawed bill. I'm somebody who's had to do caregiving for a family member at the end of their life. It is so expensive. I was unable to work for long periods of time. Luckily, my job held my position and gave me unpaid leave. But, what is the alternative? And I know we don't have time to go super deep into it, but yeah.
Well, two things. This one is a capped benefit, so it only gives $36,000. Oh, well, you don't, you rich guy, you don't understand. I understand $36,000. I grew up in a very, very poor household. I understand what that means. I also had a father who just passed away. $36,000 gets you maybe 2 to 5 months max, and then it's done. It's not a long-term solution. So calling it that is sort of a misnomer. And then secondly,
do you is there a federal solution that you see, like expanding Medicaid, expanding eligibility? Because Medicaid right now, you have to spend all your money. Down. You have to be destitute to qualify.
Right. That's right. And that's another problem with this, is that someone that's in Medicaid, they're basically subsidizing everybody above them. So if I'm in Medicaid, I still have to pay into this, but I'm not going to take that benefit. So I think it's a terrible system. I don't know the perfect solution on this, quite honestly. I think that if I dug into this and went down the rabbit hole, I'll bet you money I would find that there are regulations on our current insurance programs that significantly cause it to be a pain in the neck and therefore more expensive to handle. There were 5 insurance companies offering programs before long-term care came in. When long-term care launched, all 5 of them, it went down to 1 at one point, and then it went down to 0. There are now, from what my HR company my HR staff tell me, there's one company offering it for companies over 50 employees and one for under 50 employees. From the private market. But we had at least 5, so that the option has disappeared.
Should there be a public option?
I don't think that the public has proven. Show me one that works well. And Social Security and Medicare.
The VA, I would say. The VA is by and large something that, people go to the hospitals, they get good care, and we fulfill that for people who served our country.
I think we probably don't fulfill it enough for people that served our country. I think there should probably be more support there. Is it well run? Ask any of my military friends. It is not a well-run program.
All right. Let's just because we're running up against time, we'll debate the VA and the satisfaction with care another day. So finally, let's just zoom back out. You are not the first person who has kind of become known as the anti-tax initiative guy in the state. Tim Eyman has been cutting taxes for decades. And I think that I want to talk about one Eyman initiative in particular and ask your perspective on it. This is I-695, which voters approved in 1999 by a sizable margin, 56% of the vote. This scrapped the motor vehicle excise tax in the state, replaced it with a $30 car tab fee. We all remember folks who lived here, the $30 tabs campaign. There was a legal challenge, but the legislature ended up passing virtually the skeleton of that policy. So removing that excise tax came at a cost. It blew a significant hole in the ferry budget. When I talked to longtime state workers, not politicians, like state workers, about how we got to this place with our aging fleet and cancellations, they point to this funding loss from I-695. Now, of course, the legislature had some years to move money around, to reprioritize, as you say. They're not off the hook. But those are significant amounts of money. That initiative like 695 took out of the state. So if we bring it back to today, we're looking at the capital gains tax, the carbon auctions. These are designed, according to supporters, to fund big long-term investments in green infrastructure and in schools. If the initiatives pass that are repealing these, you are looking at long-term funding implications for everybody who lives in the state. So my question is, if efforts today cause a next-generation ferry funding crisis, for example, how would you feel about that?
Well, I'm going to push back on the premise because what I've heard already just on the CCA, so the legislature plays this game with the voters that I think is just so disingenuous, and I've heard them doing it on the CCA. We have a transportation budget. All the money from the gas tax goes into the transportation budget. So then they come up with a CCA, which is this whole new bucket of money that they've never had before to do a whole bunch of bundle of things that they'd like to do that they never prioritized before when they had, as I'm going to say for the 400th time, a $19 billion surplus. They had plenty of money to do all of these things. They could have done the Climate Commitment Act money and the funding that's coming from the capital gains tax. All of that could have been done in the previous budget, but they chose other things that they said were a priority. So in this particular case, I heard the legislators say, well, if you don't fund the CCA, we've got this whole bunch of new goodies that we want to pay for with the CCA. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take transportation money and we're going to use it to pay for these things, and then we won't fix the roads. That's called extortion when people do it that aren't in the government. And I think that people need to push back when the government pulls that extortion garbage. You need to push back. And sometimes you need to say, you have an enormous budget. You had $19 billion in surplus. Utilize that in an effective way. And when we see that you're doing that effectively, not just spending, Jay Inslee's going around the state giving $1 million to all these different groups who then will shockingly support the CCA. Of course they're going to support it.
Yeah, I know you've said that you feel like the investments that the CCA are making in all these different, there's the dairy digester at WSU. There's, a bunch of different ways in which the money is getting invested. But you feel like it's buying support for
Absolutely,
the CCA.
It's buying, yeah.
But that's like how our democratic system works, right? You elect you elect legislators, they pass laws. Sometimes the laws raise revenue, and then they earmark them and they pass them out among the state. Like that's just how things work, right?
It's how you lock yourself in. It's how you get a 40-year majority with one party rule. That's how you lock that in. You pass enough tax. You take a libertarian state with no taxes. You start passing taxes, and then you start locking in groups that otherwise would be against it. But now you just gave them $1 million, and so they shockingly switch their position and support it.
So you do not believe that anything you are doing today is going to lead down the road to us looking back the way that people do with 695 and say that was the start of an issue with school funding, with we're falling behind in green investment, things like that. You reject that idea.
Completely 100%. But with this caveat that the legislature has to prioritize. And what they're saying is we don't ever want to prioritize. And if you make us prioritize by initiative, if you come back and slap us for stepping over the bounds, if you smack us and tell us to keep within our bounds, we will punish you by shifting the money around and we'll create. If there is something, I promise you it's because the legislature did a sleight of hand and shifted money from the place that it was supposed to go to another place and then claimed poverty. It's a pattern they've done 100 times.
Brian Heywood, I have so enjoyed this conversation. I feel like we could keep going here. It's just such a pleasure to have you in, and I think it's really important for folks to hear where you're coming from, to hear, this the philosophy behind a lot of this stuff and your perspective, especially for an NPR audience. I don't think that they get to hear this perspective a lot, and so I've really appreciated it. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org. KUOW is here to help you cut through the noise of election season. Check out Sound Politics, a new podcast hosted by me, Libby Denkmann, and Scott Greenstone. Plus, KUOW's partnership with A Braver Way podcast hosted by Monica Guzman, your guide across the political divide. More at KUOW.org/elections.